The morning of September 14th, 1851, began with ash falling on Beaufort County like snow in summer. Plantation owners 20 miles from the Hartwell estate woke to find gray flakes settling on their breakfast tables, drifting through open windows, coating the magnolia leaves with a fine powder that smelled of burned wood and something else, something organic and wrong. By the time riders reached what remained of Hartwell House, the fire had consumed everything. The main residence, the kitchen building, the overseer's cottage, all reduced to charred timbers still smoking in the dawn heat. In the center of the ruins, searchers found Marcus Hartwell's bed frame, iron posts twisted by temperatures that had turned bone to ash. Beside it, a kerosene lamp lay on its side, its glass chimney shattered. And in the quarters beyond the oak trees, 47 enslaved people sat in absolute silence, their faces turned toward the smoke rising from their master's pyre. When the sheriff asked who had been inside the house, no one spoke. When he demanded to know where the girl called Ruth had gone, every face remained blank as stone. Beaufort County, South Carolina, occupied the heart of the Sea Island Cotton Empire, where the Combahee River met the Atlantic and fortunes were measured in bales and bodies. The soil here was rich, the growing season long, and the system of forced labor so entrenched that white families spoke of it the way others discussed weather. Inevitable, natural, beyond question. Marcus Hartwell had inherited his father's estate in 1845, taking possession of 800 acres, a two-story brick mansion, and 53 human beings whose names appeared in the ledger between entries for livestock and farm equipment. He was 31 years old, educated at the College of Charleston, unmarried, and known in Beaufort society as a man of refined tastes and progressive agricultural methods. He subscribed to journals. He corresponded with other planters about crop rotation and irrigation. He attended church every Sunday and contributed generously to the missionary fund. What he did in darkness was documented only in the bodies of the women who worked his fields and house. The girl called Ruth had arrived at Hartwell Estate in the spring of 1849, purchased at a Charleston auction for $600. She was 14 years old, born on a tobacco plantation in Virginia, sold south when her previous owner died, and his heirs liquidated the estate. The bill of sale listed her as Negro girl, healthy, docile, suitable for housework. She was none of those things by the time September came. Ruth worked in the main house under the supervision of Grace, the head house servant who had lived at Hartwell Estate for 20 years. Grace was 43, sharp-eyed, and skilled at navigating the impossible mathematics of survival. She taught Ruth how to move through rooms without making sound, how to anticipate Hartwell's needs before he voiced them, how to make herself invisible when visibility meant danger. She also taught Ruth things she could not say aloud, which floorboards creaked, where the keys hung in the study, how to read the weather in Hartwell's moods. He drinks more when the cotton prices fall, Grace told her one afternoon in August of 1850, both of them polishing silver in the pantry. Drinks more means he gets mean. Mean means you stay out of sight until morning. Ruth understood the code. Grace was warning her that Hartwell had developed a pattern, a rotation through the women of his household that followed no schedule except his appetites. He had summoned Grace herself perhaps 30 times over the years. He had summoned Clara, who worked in the dairy. He had summoned Jane, who cleaned the upstairs rooms. And he had begun summoning Ruth. The first time came in late September of 1849, 3 months after her arrival. Hartwell sent word through Grace that Ruth should bring fresh linens to his bedroom after supper. Ruth was 14 years old and understood what this meant. She climbed the stairs with her arms full of folded sheets, her mind searching desperately for some escape that did not exist. When she reached his door, Hartwell was sitting in a chair by the window, still dressed, a glass of bourbon in his hand. "Set those down," he said, not looking at her. "Then come here." What happened in that room over the next hour left no visible marks. Hartwell understood the economics of property damage, but it changed something fundamental in Ruth's understanding of the world. Before that night, she had been enslaved but alive, her mind still capable of imagining futures where things might be different. After that night, she understood that some cages had no doors. He summoned her again in October, and again in November. By December, a pattern had emerged. Twice a month, sometimes more. Always after dark. Always with the same careful brutality that left no evidence anyone beyond the walls of that bedroom would recognize. Grace tried to help in the only way she could. She prepared teas from herbs that prevented pregnancy, bitter concoctions Ruth drank without question. She taught Ruth how to clean herself afterward, how to hide the evidence of what had been done. She never spoke of it directly, never named what they both knew. Some knowledge was too dangerous to voice. By the summer of 1851, Ruth was 16 years old and no longer recognized herself. The girl who had arrived from Virginia was gone, replaced by someone who moved through the world like smoke, present but untouchable. Her mind carefully separated from her body because that separation was the only sanctuary left. But separation has limits. The Hartwell household ran on rhythms older than memory, daily cycles that seemed natural only because no one questioned them. The enslaved population woke before dawn, worked until sunset, slept in quarters that had stood in the same clearing for 3 generations. White visitors to the estate remarked on how well-ordered everything appeared, how the fields stayed clean and the house maintained its elegance despite the absence of a mistress to oversee domestic affairs. They did not ask why Hartwell never married. They did not ask why the women in his household rarely looked directly at guests. They did not ask because asking would require acknowledging what everyone already knew and collectively agreed to ignore. The system protected itself through practiced blindness. Hartwell employed an overseer named Thomas Wickham, a lean man from Georgia who managed the field workers with calculated cruelty. Wickham lived in a cottage 50 yards from the main house, kept detailed records of cotton yields and labor output, and administered punishment with the methodical precision of someone who viewed human suffering as a management tool. 10 lashes for tardiness, 20 for talking back, 50 for attempting to run. The county records from Beaufort showed that Wickham filed reports twice yearly, documenting the plantation's productivity. Bales produced, acres planted, tools purchased. The human costs never appeared in those columns. The woman who died in childbirth was listed as a loss of property value. The man who collapsed from heat stroke was noted as a temporary reduction in labor capacity. The children born into bondage were assets added to the estate's total worth. Marcus Hartwell reviewed these reports in his study, surrounded by leather-bound books and mahogany furniture shipped from Charleston. He added marginal notes in precise handwriting, approved expenditures, suggested improvements to efficiency, never once acknowledged that the numbers represented living people with names and families and hopes that extended beyond his profit calculations. In August of 1851, Hartwell traveled to Beaufort for a meeting of the County Agricultural Society, leaving Wickham in charge of the estate. He stayed 3 days, attending lectures on soil management and discussing politics with other plantation owners who spoke confidently about states' rights and the natural order of civilization. When he returned, he brought new equipment, better plows, stronger rope. a set of iron shackles that Wickham installed in the barn for workers who required, in Hartwell's words, additional correction. Ruth saw those shackles from the house windows and felt something cold settle in her chest. The plantation was tightening its grip. Hartwell was investing in permanence, in structures designed to last generations. That same week, Grace took ill. A fever that started as fatigue and escalated to violent chills that left her bedridden. The plantation had no doctor for enslaved workers. Wickham's solution was to wait and see if Grace recovered or died. Since calling a physician would cost money Hartwell preferred not to spend. Ruth found herself managing the household alone. She cooked Hartwell's meals, cleaned his rooms, maintained the fiction that everything was normal while Grace lay in the quarters, shaking with fever, her skin burning hot to the touch. On September 1st, Hartwell summoned Ruth to his bedroom earlier than usual. 6 in the evening, still light outside. She climbed the stairs with a sense of dread that had become so familiar it felt like part of her skeleton. This time was different. This time he was drunk before she arrived, bourbon thick on his breath, his movements sloppy and violent in ways they had not been before. He grabbed her wrist hard enough to leave bruises, shoved her toward the bed with a force that made her stumble. And when she tried to move away, tried to create even an inch of distance, he hit her across the face with the back of his hand. The blow split her lip and sent her reeling into the bedpost. Blood filled her mouth, warm and metallic. For a moment, Ruth's mind went completely white, not with pain, but with a clarity so sharp it felt like breaking through ice into freezing water. She understood in that instant that this would not stop, that Hartwell would use her until she broke, then replace her with someone younger. That Grace's illness meant Ruth had no protection, no guidance, no ally who understood the specific horror of what happened in this room. That the system was designed to isolate its victims, to make them believe they were alone in their suffering, to prevent any collective resistance. And she understood something else. Something that had been building in her mind for 2 years, but had never crystallized until this moment. She was going to die here, either slowly, worn down by years of abuse until her body gave out, or suddenly, when Hartwell's violence escalated beyond what flesh could survive. The math was simple and absolute, unless she changed the equation. The kitchen building at Hartwell Estate stood 20 feet from the main house, connected by a covered walkway that kept rain off servants carrying food. Inside, copper pots hung from ceiling hooks, cast iron cookware sat ready on the brick hearth, and bottles of lamp oil lined a shelf near the door. The oil was expensive, imported from Pennsylvania, used for the household lamps that made nighttime reading possible for a man who valued his evening correspondence. Ruth had filled those lamps 100 times. She knew exactly how much oil each one held, how the liquid caught the light when you tilted the bottle, how it smelled faintly of earth and ancient plant matter compressed into fuel. She also knew it burned. After the incident on September 1st, Ruth moved through the house with a new kind of attention. She still performed her duties, still cooked Hartwell's meals and cleaned his rooms and appeared when summoned. But part of her mind had separated from those tasks, had begun cataloging information with the cold precision of someone planning a long journey. The layout of the house. 2 stories, brick construction, wooden floors and staircases. Hartwell's bedroom on the 2nd floor, east wing, windows facing the fields. The study directly below. The parlor and dining room on the ground level. Servants' access through the back kitchen door. The front entrance reserved for Hartwell and his rare guests. the household's schedule. Hartwell retired to his bedroom around 9 each evening. He read for an hour, sometimes 2, lamp burning on the bedside table. He kept a decanter of bourbon within reach, refilled each afternoon. He slept heavily once the alcohol took effect, often not waking until dawn. The location of keys, study desk, top drawer. One set for the main house, one for the outbuildings, one for the locked cabinet where Hartwell kept documents and a small amount of cash. Ruth had seen them many times while cleaning, had memorized their shapes without fully understanding why. Now she understood. Grace recovered slowly from her fever, returning to light duties by mid-September. She noticed the bruise on Ruth's face but said nothing directly. Instead, she began teaching Ruth things that seemed unrelated to housework. How to move through the quarters without being seen from the overseer's cottage. Which paths through the woods led away from the main roads. The names of families on neighboring plantations who might offer shelter to someone in desperate need, though she never explained what kind of need she meant. One evening in late September, Grace and Ruth sat together in the kitchen after supper, supposedly washing dishes. The sun had set, and only a single lamp lit their work. "You can't run," Grace said quietly, her hands still moving through the dishwater. "They'll catch you. Dogs, patrollers, bounty hunters. You might make it 10 miles, maybe 20 if you're lucky. Then they bring you back, and what happens next makes everything before seem gentle." Ruth didn't respond. She kept scrubbing a pot that was already clean. "But," Grace continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "there are other kinds of leaving." The weight of those words hung between them. Ruth understood that Grace was offering something more valuable than escape routes. She was offering permission, acknowledgement that some situations had no moral solution, only survival calculations. That night, after Hartwell had gone to bed, after the house had settled into the particular silence of late hours, Ruth stood in the kitchen and looked at the bottles of lamp oil. She picked one up, felt its weight, imagined what would happen if she carried it upstairs and simply poured it across Hartwell's bedroom floor while he slept. The fire would spread fast in a wooden house filled with fabric and furniture. The smoke would wake him, but by then the flames would have blocked the door. He would die the way fire deaths always happened. Smoke inhalation first, then the burning. Quick enough to be merciful, slow enough to know what was coming. She set the bottle down and walked away. Not yet. Not until she had planned every step. Not until she was ready to accept what came after. Because Ruth understood that burning Hartwell alive would not set her free. It would make her a murderer in the eyes of the law, a fugitive who would be hunted across state lines. But it would also mean Hartwell could never touch her again, never touch anyone again. And there was a kind of freedom in that finality, even if it came wrapped in consequences she could not fully imagine. The tools were all around her. Oil and flame and darkness and a house built from materials that would burn like kindling once the fire took hold. The question was not whether she could do it, but whether she was willing to accept the price of doing it. September turned into October. Hartwell summoned her 3 more times. Each visit left her more certain that this could not continue, that something had to break before she did. The night she made her final decision, a storm was building over the Sea Islands. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and wind moved through the live oak trees with a sound like breathing. Ruth stood in the kitchen, alone, a bottle of lamp oil in her hands. She had stopped asking herself whether what she was planning was right or wrong. Those categories belonged to people who had choices. She had only one question left. Could she live with what came next? The enslaved community at Hartwell Estate numbered 47 people in September of 1851. They lived in a double row of cabins beyond the oak grove, structures built from rough-cut pine with dirt floors and gaps between the boards, wide enough to let in wind and rain. Each cabin housed a family or group of unrelated individuals thrown together by the logic of property allocation. Privacy was a fiction. Sound carried through the thin walls. Everyone knew everyone else's business because concealment was impossible. They also knew about Ruth. Not the specific details of what happened in Hartwell's bedroom, but the pattern. The late-night summonses. The way Ruth moved the next day, careful and slow, her eyes fixed on nothing. The other women recognized the signs because they had lived them themselves or watched their mothers and sisters live them. The system was designed to be visible enough to terrorize the community while remaining unspoken enough to preserve the fiction of propriety. A woman named Sarah, 40 years old and mother to 3 children, worked in the fields but kept a garden plot behind her cabin where she grew herbs and vegetables. She had been at Hartwell Estate for 15 years, since Marcus Hartwell's father owned the property. She had survived 3 overseers, 2 changes in crop rotation, and countless acts of casual cruelty that white people called discipline. She had also watched 5 women be destroyed by what Marcus Hartwell did in his bedroom. One had died in childbirth, carrying a child everyone knew was Hartwell's, despite the official fiction that enslaved women simply became pregnant through mysterious means. One had been sold away after she tried to refuse, sent to a sugar plantation in Louisiana where the average life expectancy was 7 years. One had walked into the Combahee River and drowned herself, her body found 3 days later caught in the marsh grass. 2 had simply broken, their minds retreating to places where Hartwell's hands could not reach, leaving behind bodies that moved through daily tasks like clockwork that had forgotten its purpose. Sarah watched Ruth following the same trajectory and felt a familiar rage mixed with helplessness. There was nothing she could do, no appeal to make, no authority to petition, no law that recognized what was happening as a crime. The system was built to prevent exactly this kind of intervention, so Sarah did what she could. She brought Ruth extra food when supplies ran low. She sat with her sometimes in the evening after work, not speaking, just offering the comfort of shared presence. She made sure Ruth knew where to find her if the worst happened, if Ruth needed help with an unwanted pregnancy or an injury too severe to hide. But she also watched Ruth's face harden over the months, watched the light behind her eyes change from fear to something colder and more calculating. By late September, Sarah recognized that look. She had seen it before in people who had reached the edge of what they could endure and were planning something irreversible. One evening in early October, Sarah found Ruth sitting on the step of Grace's cabin, staring at nothing. Sarah sat down beside her without asking permission. "Whatever you're thinking," Sarah said quietly, "think it through all the way. Don't just plan the doing, plan the after." Ruth didn't respond for a long moment. Then, barely audible, "There is no after." "There's always an after, even if it's not the after you want." Ruth turned to look at her, and Sarah saw something in that gaze that made her chest tighten. Not desperation, not fear, just a cold certainty that reminded Sarah of stone settling into place after a foundation is poured. "What would you do?" Ruth asked. Not rhetorical, a genuine question. Sarah thought about her children, about the compromises she made every day to keep them safe, to keep them together, to preserve some small space where they could be something other than property. She thought about the calculations every enslaved person made constantly. weighing survival against dignity, endurance against resistance. "I don't know," she said honestly, "but I know this. Whatever you do, we didn't see it. We didn't hear it. We don't know nothing about nothing. That's how we survive what comes next." It was the closest Sarah could come to offering support, without making herself complicit in whatever Ruth was planning. And it was the closest Ruth would come to asking permission. 2 weeks later, Sarah would wake to the smell of smoke and understand exactly what Ruth had decided. Beaufort County operated on systems that had been refined over generations, mechanisms designed to preserve power through violence and the threat of violence. Every institution, the courthouse, the sheriff's office, the churches, the banks, worked in concert to maintain the social order that placed white men at the top and everyone else beneath them in carefully calibrated tiers. The sheriff of Beaufort County in 1851 was a man named William Carver, elected to his position by property-owning white men who expected him to protect their interests above all else. Carver was 53 years old, a veteran of the Seminole Wars, and a slave owner himself. He owned 6 people who worked a small farm outside Beaufort, where his wife and 2 adult sons managed the day-to-day operations. Carver understood his job primarily as maintaining the system that protected wealth and property. When enslaved people ran away, he organized patrols to hunt them down. When disputes arose between white planters, he mediated with careful attention to who held more political influence. When violence occurred, white against white, he investigated with the full weight of the law. When violence occurred, white against black, he filed a report and did nothing. The county kept records of every enslaved person within its boundaries: names, ages, physical descriptions, skills, owners. These records were updated annually, cross-referenced with tax documents and property deeds. The system tracked human beings with the same attention to detail used for livestock and land. In the ledger for Hartwell Estate, Ruth appeared as Negro girl, Ruth, age approximately 16, house servant, value $600. That single line was the entirety of her legal existence. No last name, no family history, no acknowledgement of personhood beyond economic value. If she died, the ledger would note a loss of property. If she ran, the ledger would note a theft. If she killed her owner, the ledger would be irrelevant because the law allowed only one response to such an act: public execution after a swift trial. The South Carolina Legal Code of 1851 was explicit on this point. Enslaved people could not testify against white people in court. They could not own property. They could not enter into contracts. They could not move freely without written permission. And if they killed a white person, the trial was a formality preceding the hanging. But the law also created a curious gap in its logic. If an enslaved person destroyed property, the owner bore the loss. If an enslaved person committed murder and was executed, the owner lost the value of that human property. This created a financial incentive structure that sometimes protected enslaved people from the worst violence, not out of compassion, but out of economic calculation. Marcus Hartwell was worth approximately $40,000 in 1851, counting land, equipment, crops, and enslaved workers. If Ruth killed him, the estate would pass to his closest relative, a cousin in Charleston who had visited twice in 6 years and shown no interest in managing a plantation. The cousin would likely sell the property, scattering the enslaved community across different buyers, breaking apart families that had lived together for generations. This was the web of incentives and consequences that surrounded every action Ruth might take. Not just her own survival, but the survival of 46 other people whose fates were tied to the estate's stability. The church in Beaufort offered no alternative. Reverend Samuel Prentice preached every Sunday about Christian duty and the divine order that placed masters over servants. He quoted scripture. He spoke of patience and obedience as virtues that would be rewarded in heaven. He collected donations from plantation owners and used them to fund missionary work that taught enslaved people to read just enough to study the Bible, but not enough to read newspapers or write passes. Prentice knew about men like Marcus Hartwell. He knew because he heard confessions, because he attended social gatherings where planters spoke freely, because the entire white community understood what happened behind closed doors and agreed collectively to never name it directly. When questioned years later about conditions on the plantations in his parish, Prentice would say he had no knowledge of any cruelty beyond the normal discipline required to manage agricultural labor. He would say he never heard complaints. He would say the enslaved people in his community seemed content. These were not lies exactly. They were the practiced blindness that allowed good men to participate in evil systems while maintaining their self-image as moral beings. The banks in Charleston held mortgages on properties throughout the Sea Islands. They accepted enslaved people as collateral, appraising them like furniture or livestock. If a planter defaulted on a loan, the bank seized human beings and sold them to recover the debt. The ledgers recorded these transactions in columns marked "Assets Liquidated." Every institution was complicit. Every structure designed to prevent exactly the kind of resistance Ruth was planning. And everyone knew it. The question was whether knowing mattered when the machinery of silence was powerful enough to erase truth the moment it threatened power. Grace had been teaching Ruth to read in secret for over a year, a crime punishable by whipping under South Carolina law. They worked in the early morning hours before Hartwell woke, using a primer Grace had hidden behind a loose board in the kitchen. The book was worn from use, its pages soft as cloth from being folded and unfolded countless times. Grace could read because she had been taught as a child by a previous owner who believed enslaved people worked more efficiently if they could follow written instructions. That owner had died, and Grace had been sold to Hartwell's father, who neither knew nor cared about her literacy as long as she performed her duties. She taught Ruth because literacy was a weapon, even if it was a weapon that could not save you from immediate violence. It meant you could read passes and forge them. It meant you could decipher maps and understand distances. It meant you could document what happened to you in words that might outlast your body. Ruth learned quickly. By October of 1851, she could read simple sentences and write in careful block letters. Grace had her practice on scraps of paper that were burned immediately after use, leaving no evidence. One morning in mid-October, Ruth wrote something that made Grace pause. His name was Marcus Hartwell, and he was a monster. 7 words. Simple, direct, true. Grace looked at the paper, then at Ruth. Why did you write that? Because someone should know, even if it's just us, even if it burns in a minute. Grace folded the paper carefully and held it over the lamp flame until it caught fire. They watched it turn to ash together, neither speaking. The knowledge survived even after the evidence disappeared. Ruth had also been collecting objects, small things that went unnoticed in the daily inventory of the household. A box of matches from the study, a candle stub from Hartwell's bedroom, a small metal file she'd found in the barn and hidden behind the loose brick in the kitchen where Grace kept the primer. She didn't have a clear plan yet for how these items would be used, but she understood instinctively that escape or resistance would require tools. You could not fight a system with bare hands alone. You needed leverage, weapons, materials that could be transformed into something dangerous. The lamp oil remained her primary focus. Hartwell kept a large stock in the storage shed, gallons of it, enough to fuel the household lamps for months. Ruth began the practice of refilling the lamps more frequently than necessary, taking small amounts of oil and transferring it to a bottle she kept hidden in the crawlspace beneath the kitchen. By early November, she had collected nearly 2 quarts, enough to start a fire that would spread faster than anyone could stop it, but she still hadn't decided when or how to act. The tools were gathered. The knowledge was in place. What she lacked was the final certainty that this was the only path remaining. That certainty came on November 9th, 1851. Hartwell summoned Ruth to his bedroom on a Thursday evening after a day of cold rain that left everything damp and miserable. He had been drinking since late afternoon, bourbon mixing with anger over cotton prices that had fallen again, threatening his profit margins for the year. When Ruth entered the room, she found him standing by the window, his reflection ghost-like in the dark glass. He didn't turn around when she closed the door. "Do you know what you cost me?" he said, his voice slurred but venomous. $600, 2 years ago. That money would have bought better equipment, more land, something useful. Ruth stood near the door, silent, waiting for whatever was coming. "You're a bad investment," Hartwell continued. "You don't work hard enough. You're too slow, too quiet, too nothing." He turned to face her, and his eyes held a coldness that was worse than anger. "I should have bought someone else." What followed was worse than any previous night. Hartwell was not just violent, but deliberately cruel, using his words as weapons alongside his hands. He cataloged everything he found worthless about her: her appearance, her manner, her very existence. And when he was finished, when Ruth lay on the floor with blood in her mouth and her mind screaming for this to end, he told her to clean up the mess and get out. She walked back to the quarters in the rain, her body a map of fresh injuries that would fade to bruises by morning. Sarah saw her come in and said nothing, just brought water and cloths and sat with her while Ruth cleaned herself as best she could. "Tonight?" Sarah asked quietly. Ruth nodded. "The storm will help. Sounds will carry less. Fire will spread faster with the wind." It was the most explicit acknowledgement of what Ruth was planning that anyone had voiced. Sarah was offering tactical advice, making herself complicit through silence and support. "They'll know it was me," Ruth said. "They'll suspect. But knowing and proving are different things. And if you're not here to question, they can't make you confess." "Where do I go?" Sarah told her. There was a network, fragile and dangerous, of people who helped runaways. A farm 8 miles north, owned by a free black family who took in fugitives and moved them along to the next station. If Ruth could reach that farm before dawn, before the alarm was raised, she might have a chance. Not a good chance. Maybe 1 in 10 of making it to a free state. But 1 in 10 was better than 0. Ruth returned to her cabin and waited for the house to settle into sleep. Around her, the quarters were quiet except for the rain and the occasional sound of someone coughing or a child crying briefly before being soothed back to silence. She thought about the 46 people who would wake tomorrow to find Hartwell dead and their world transformed. Some would be relieved. Some would be terrified. All would be implicated simply by being present when a white man died at the hands of someone he had owned. The guilt of that realization nearly stopped her. But then she thought about Hartwell's hands, his voice, the way he had looked at her like she was nothing more than an object he had purchased and could destroy at will. She thought about the 5 women Sarah had mentioned, the ones who had died or been broken before Ruth arrived, the ones who would come after if this continued. Sometimes justice looked like murder because the law had failed so completely that murder was the only option left. At 11, that night, Ruth took the bottle of lamp oil she had hidden and walked through the rain toward the big house. The Hartwell mansion had been built in 1798 by Marcus Hartwell's grandfather, constructed from brick and timber in the Georgian style popular among wealthy planters who wanted their homes to announce prosperity and permanence. 3 chimneys rose from the roof. Wide windows let in the coastal light. A central staircase led to the 2nd floor, where family bedrooms and guest rooms occupied the east and west wings. The house had survived 2 hurricanes and countless smaller storms, its foundation solid, its walls thick enough to keep out heat in summer and cold in winter. It was designed to last for generations, a monument to the family wealth built on the labor of people who would never own anything themselves. Ruth knew every inch of it. She had cleaned these rooms for 2 years, had memorized the location of every piece of furniture, every rug, every curtain. She knew where the old wood was driest, where the draft pulled strongest, where a fire would take hold fastest. She entered through the kitchen door, which she had left unlocked earlier that evening. The main house was dark and silent. Hartwell was asleep upstairs, his lamp extinguished, his body heavy with bourbon. The storm masked the sound of Ruth's footsteps as she moved through the downstairs rooms. She started in the study, poured oil across the wooden desk where Hartwell kept his ledgers, soaked the curtains that framed the tall windows, drizzled it along the baseboards where dust and old wood would catch quickly. The smell was strong, chemical and organic at once, but the rain and wind covered it. She moved to the parlor next. More oil on the furniture, the rugs, the portrait of Hartwell's father that hung above the fireplace. She worked methodically, without hurry, giving herself time to be certain about what she was doing. This was not impulse. This was not madness. This was a decision made with full awareness of its costs. When the downstairs was prepared, Ruth climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor. The wood creaked softly beneath her feet, familiar sounds that would not wake Hartwell. She could hear him breathing in his bedroom, the heavy rhythmic sound of someone deep in alcohol-induced sleep. She stood outside his door for a long moment, the bottle of oil in her hands, making her final calculations. If she turned back now, she could clean up the oil downstairs, could destroy the evidence, could continue surviving the way she had been surviving, could endure. But endurance had a limit, and Ruth had reached it. She opened Hartwell's bedroom door slowly. The hinges made no sound. Inside, she could see his shape in the bed, one arm flung across the pillow, his face turned toward the window. The kerosene lamp sat on the bedside table, unlit but full of fuel. Ruth poured the remaining oil across the floor in a path from the door to the bed. She poured it on the curtains, on the rug, on the bedposts. Hartwell did not wake. The bourbon had taken him too deep. Then Ruth took the box of matches from her pocket and struck one against the rough brick of the fireplace. The flame caught with a small hiss. She touched it to the oil on the floor and watched the fire spread like water running downhill, blue and orange and bright enough to paint the room in colors that looked like sunset and hell combined. The fire reached the bed before Hartwell woke. When he did, his first sound was confusion, not fear. A question half formed before the smoke choked it off. Ruth stood in the doorway and watched him realize what was happening. watched him try to stand and collapse as the smoke filled his lungs, watched the flames catch the bedding and his nightshirt and his hair. She watched until she was certain he could not escape. Then she turned and walked down the stairs, through the burning house, out into the rain that would not be enough to stop what she had started. Behind her, Marcus Hartwell died the way he had lived, screaming. The fire spread faster than Ruth had calculated, fed by the oil and the old dry wood and the draft that pulled through the house like breath through lungs. By the time she reached the quarters, flames were visible through every window on the first floor, and smoke poured from the second-story bedrooms in thick black columns that climbed toward the storm clouds. People began emerging from their cabins, drawn by the smell and the light. They stood in the rain, watching the big house burn, their faces illuminated by the orange glow. No one spoke. No one ran to fight the fire. They simply watched. Sarah found Ruth standing at the edge of the clearing, still holding the empty oil bottle. She took it from Ruth's hands without a word and walked it to the creek, where she threw it into the deepest part of the current. When she returned, she said, "You need to go now, before the neighbors come, before Wickham figures out what to do." Ruth nodded but didn't move. She was watching the fire consume the second floor, watching the roof begin to cave in where the support beams had burned through. Somewhere in that inferno was Marcus Hartwell's body, turning to ash and bone fragments that would be indistinguishable from the burned timber. Grace appeared beside Ruth and pressed something into her hand. A cloth bundle containing bread, dried meat, and a pass that Grace had forged years ago and kept hidden for exactly this kind of emergency. The pass identified Ruth as a freed woman traveling north to visit family. It would not stand up to close scrutiny, but it might buy her hours if she was stopped by patrollers who could not read well enough to spot the forgery. "The fire will spread to the outbuildings," Grace said. "Maybe the quarters if the wind shifts. We need to move everyone to the far field until it burns out." It was a practical concern delivered in a flat voice that told Ruth everything she needed to know. Grace was choosing the living over judgment. Whatever Ruth had done, the community would survive it. "I'm sorry," Ruth said. "Don't be sorry. Just live. Make it mean something." Ruth looked at the 46 people gathered in the rain, watching their world transform. Some would be sold when the estate was liquidated. Some would be scattered. All would carry the memory of this night for the rest of their lives. She wanted to say something that would justify what she had done, that would make the cost they would bear worth it. But there were no words for that calculus. She had chosen her survival over their stability, and that choice was irreversible. So she said nothing. Just turned and walked north into the darkness, following the road Sarah had described, moving away from the fire that was still burning, still consuming, still turning everything Marcus Hartwell had built into smoke and ash. Dawn came gray and wet over Beaufort County. The rain had stopped sometime before sunrise, leaving the air thick with humidity and the smell of burned wood that had settled over the landscape like a stain. Sheriff William Carver arrived at what remained of Hartwell Estate around 7 in the morning, accompanied by 3 deputies and a dozen white men from neighboring plantations who had seen the smoke and ridden over to help fight the fire. By the time they arrived, there was nothing left to save. The main house was gone. Only the brick chimneys remained standing, columns of soot-stained masonry rising from a foundation filled with collapsed timbers and ash. The kitchen building had burned. The overseer's cottage had caught fire and been destroyed. The barn had survived, and the quarters had been spared when the wind shifted. but everything else was ruin. The enslaved population stood in a group near the far field, exactly where Grace had led them during the fire. They watched the white men pick through the debris, their faces carefully blank. Wickham, the overseer, was speaking rapidly to Carver, gesturing toward the quarters, clearly agitated. He had slept through the fire's early stages, waking only when the heat became intense enough to crack the windows of his cottage. By then, it was too late to save anything. It started in the big house, Wickham was saying. Had to. That's where it was burning hottest. Could be a lamp got knocked over. Could be lightning from the storm. Could be someone set it, Carver said flatly. Wickham stopped mid-sentence. You think one of them? I think we need to account for everyone on this property, and I think we need to find out if anyone's missing. Wickham walked to the group of enslaved people and began counting. Once, twice. His face changed on the second count. Someone's gone, he said. The girl, Ruth. She's not here. Carver's expression hardened. He walked to where Sarah stood with Grace and several others. Where's the girl called Ruth? Don't know, sir, Sarah said, her voice steady. Ain't seen her since last night. When last night? Before the fire. She went to her cabin after supper. Didn't see her after that. Anyone else see her? Silence. Every face carefully neutral. Carver studied them, looking for the crack in their story, the tell that would reveal who was lying. But these were people who had spent their entire lives hiding truth from power. Their silence was practiced and absolute. Search the quarters, Carver ordered. Every cabin, every hiding place, and send riders north and south. If she ran, she can't have gotten far. The deputies began pulling apart the cabins, dumping out the few belongings people had accumulated, looking for evidence. They found nothing. No forged papers, no stolen goods. No indication that anyone had been planning to run. What they did find, when they sifted through the burned remains of the big house, made Carver call for the county coroner. In the center of what had been Hartwell's bedroom, the iron bed frame still stood, twisted by heat but intact. In the middle of it was what remained of Marcus Hartwell. Not much. The fire had been hot enough to reduce most of his body to bone fragments and ash. But enough survived for the coroner to make a determination. Died before the fire consumed him, the coroner said, examining what was left of the skull. Smoke inhalation most likely. Would have lost consciousness quickly once the room filled. Probably never knew what was happening. It was a mercy Hartwell did not deserve, but the coroner's report would list the cause of death as accidental, the result of a fire that started from unknown causes during a storm. The law required something different when enslaved people were involved in a white person's death. The law required investigation, trial, and execution. But the law also required a body to prosecute, and Ruth was gone. The patrollers who hunted for Ruth were professionals, men who made their living tracking runaways, returning them to their owners for bounties that ranged from $10 to $50, depending on how far the fugitive had run. They knew the roads and the swamps. They knew the hiding places. They knew the routes north and the farms where abolitionists sometimes offered shelter. They also had dogs. By mid-morning on September 15th, 6 men with 4 hounds were following Ruth's trail north from Hartwell Estate. The rain had made tracking difficult, washing away scent in some places, but the dogs found it again where Ruth had cut through the woods to avoid the main road. Ruth had approximately an 8-hour head start. She had walked through the night, moving as fast as exhaustion and darkness allowed. By dawn, she was 6 miles from Hartwell Estate, following the directions Sarah had given her. watching for the landmarks that would tell her when she was getting close to the farm that might offer help. The patrollers were faster. They had horses. They had experience. They had the confidence that came from hunting people who had nowhere to go in a region where every white face was a potential enemy. Ruth heard the dogs around mid-morning. The sound carried across the fields, a baying that meant they had her scent and were closing distance. She began to run, abandoning the careful pace she had maintained through the night, knowing that speed was her only advantage now. The farm Sarah had described was still 2 miles ahead. Ruth would not reach it before the patrollers caught her. She understood this with the same cold clarity that had carried her through the previous night. The mathematics were simple. She could not outrun dogs. She could not fight 6 armed men. She had escaped Hartwell, but not the system that had created him. There was a creek ahead, swollen from the storm. Ruth reached it and waded in, hoping the water would break her scent trail. The current was strong, pulling at her legs, trying to sweep her downstream. She fought against it, moving along the creek bed, putting distance between herself and the place where the dogs would lose her trail. Behind her, the baying grew louder, then stopped abruptly. The dogs had reached the creek and lost the scent. Ruth kept moving, her body shaking from exhaustion and cold, her mind focused only on the next step and the step after that. She stayed in the water for half a mile before climbing out on the far bank. Her clothes were soaked. Her feet were bleeding from cuts inflicted by rocks and broken branches. But she was still moving, still free, still alive. The patrollers found where she had exited the creek within an hour. The dogs picked up the scent again and began baying with renewed intensity. The hunt continued. Chapter 12. The Choice at the River. By early afternoon, Ruth reached the Combahee River, the boundary between pursuit and possibility. The river was wide here, perhaps 200 feet across, its water dark and swift from the storm runoff. On the far side was the farm Sarah had described. Safety, if such a thing existed. Behind her, the dogs were close enough that Ruth could hear individual barks now, not just the general baying of the pack. She had perhaps 15 minutes before the patrollers would be in sight. The river was too wide to swim, especially in her exhausted state. But there was a fallen tree that extended maybe 20 feet from the near bank, creating a partial bridge. Beyond that, the current. Ruth walked onto the tree trunk, using branches for balance, moving as quickly as she dared. The wood was slippery from rain and moss. Halfway across the natural bridge, her foot slipped, and she nearly fell into the water. She caught herself, heart hammering, and kept moving. She reached the end of the tree and looked at the distance remaining. 180 feet of river between her and the far bank. The current strong enough to pull her under. The water dark enough to hide anything beneath its surface. Behind her, men's voices joined the dogs. The patrollers had caught up. Ruth could see them now, 6 men on horseback, riding hard along the path she had followed. They would reach the river within minutes. They would see her. They would cross, either by swimming the horses or finding a ford upstream. She could not outrun them anymore. The mathematics had run out. Ruth thought about Grace's final words. Make it mean something. She thought about the 46 people she had left behind at Hartwell Estate, facing an uncertain future because of what she had done. She thought about Marcus Hartwell burning in his bed, finally experiencing a fraction of the pain he had inflicted on others. She thought about the 5 women who had come before her and the women who would come after, trapped in a system designed to use them until they broke. And she jumped. The river was cold as winter, even though it was September. The current caught Ruth immediately, pulling her under, spinning her like debris. She fought to the surface, gasped air, went under again. The water filled her nose and mouth. Her clothes became weights trying to drag her down. She could not swim well. No one had taught her. But she kicked and flailed and somehow kept her head above water more often than below it. The current carried her downstream, away from the patrollers, away from everything. On the far bank, someone was watching. A black man, maybe 40 years old, standing near a small dock. He saw Ruth in the water and understood immediately what was happening. He grabbed a rope from the dock and waded in as far as he dared, holding one end tied to a post, throwing the other toward Ruth. The rope fell short on the first throw. On the second throw, Ruth caught it. The man pulled, bracing himself against the current, hauling Ruth toward the bank like a fish on a line. When she was close enough, he grabbed her arm and dragged her onto solid ground. "Can you walk?" he asked. Ruth nodded, too exhausted to speak. "Then we need to move. Now." Behind them, across the river, the patrollers had reached the bank. They were shouting, arguing about whether to cross here or ride upstream to find a better ford. The man led Ruth away from the river, through a stand of trees, to a farmhouse where a woman was already preparing a hiding place in the root cellar. Ruth was pushed down into darkness, and a heavy door closed over her head. She lay in the dark, listening to her own breathing, feeling the water drip from her clothes, knowing that this was not safety, just a temporary pause in the pursuit. Above her, she could hear voices. The patrollers had crossed the river. They were searching the farm, but the man and woman who owned the farm were free blacks who knew how to lie to white men. They showed the patrollers through the house. They expressed shock that anyone would think they were hiding fugitives. They maintained perfect innocence while Ruth lay 15 feet below, holding her breath, praying the searchers would not think to check the root cellar. Voices faded. The searchers left. Ruth remained in the darkness, waiting, while above her the sun moved across the sky and the world continued without her. Sheriff Carver filed his report on September 20th, 1851, 5 days after the fire at Hartwell Estate. The document, preserved in the Beaufort County Courthouse archives, listed the cause of death as accidental, the result of a fire started by unknown means during a storm. It noted that one enslaved person, a girl called Ruth, had fled the property and was presumed to have perished attempting to cross the Combahee River. Her body was never found, which the report attributed to the strong current and the presence of alligators in the river's lower reaches. The patrollers had searched for 3 days before concluding that Ruth had drowned and her remains had been consumed or carried to the sea. The report made no mention of arson, made no connection between Ruth's disappearance and the fire that killed Marcus Hartwell, made no reference to the pattern of abuse that had driven a 16-year-old girl to commit an act that required planning, courage, and the willingness to accept any consequence. The report was designed to close the case, not to reveal truth. Marcus Hartwell's cousin from Charleston arrived on September 22nd to assess the estate and determine its value. He walked through the ruins with a land assessor and made quick calculations. The property was worth more sold than rebuilt. The enslaved population was worth more divided among multiple buyers than kept together. Within a month, every person who had lived at Hartwell Estate was sold. Sarah went to a rice plantation on the coast. Grace was purchased by a family in Beaufort who needed a cook. The others were scattered across South Carolina and Georgia, their community broken apart as thoroughly as if it had never existed. None of them spoke about the night of the fire. When questioned, they maintained perfect ignorance. Ruth had disappeared. The fire had started. Those were separate facts, with no connection between them. The white community accepted this story because accepting it was easier than confronting what it meant if the alternative was true. If an enslaved girl had burned her master alive, that meant the entire system was vulnerable. It meant that the people they owned might choose death and murder over continued bondage. It meant that all their assumptions about docility and acceptance were lies built on violence and the threat of violence. Better to believe in accidents and coincidence than to acknowledge what power looked like when it flowed in the opposite direction. Ruth spent 3 weeks in the root cellar and hidden spaces of farms between the Combahee River and the North Carolina border. She moved at night, guided by people who asked no questions and expected no thanks. The network was fragile, held together by courage and the shared understanding that some fights were worth dying for. She crossed into North Carolina in early October, traveling with false papers that identified her as a freed woman named Sarah Coleman. The papers were good enough to pass casual inspection, and Ruth had learned to carry herself with the confidence of someone who had nothing to hide. She worked her way north through a series of temporary positions, washing clothes in Raleigh, cooking in Richmond, cleaning rooms in a boarding house in Baltimore. Each job paid little and demanded much, but each job was hers to leave if she chose. That freedom, the ability to walk away, was worth more than Ruth could calculate. She reached Philadelphia in November of 1851 and found work with a Quaker family who asked where she had come from, but did not press when she declined to answer in detail. They were part of the abolition movement, and they understood that some histories were too dangerous to speak aloud. Ruth lived in Philadelphia for 6 years. She learned to read well, then to write with confidence. She attended lectures. She joined a church. She built a life that had nothing to do with Marcus Hartwell or Beaufort County or the fire that had freed her. In 1857, she married a free black carpenter named James Foster and took his name. They had 3 children who grew up knowing their mother had come from the South, but never knowing the full story of how she had escaped. Ruth never returned to South Carolina, never contacted anyone from Hartwell Estate, though she thought about Sarah and Grace constantly. Never spoke publicly about what she had done on the night of September 14th, 1851. But she kept a journal, written in careful script, documenting everything: the abuse, the planning, the fire, the escape. She wrote it as a kind of testament, a record that would survive even if she did not, even if the truth was never acknowledged in any official capacity. The journal survived in her family for 3 generations before being donated to a historical society in Philadelphia in 1923. By then, Ruth had been dead for 40 years, buried in a cemetery under a headstone that listed her name as Ruth Foster and gave no indication of her past. The Historical Society filed the journal in their archives without fanfare. It sat there for decades, a fragile manuscript among thousands, until a graduate student found it in 1978 while researching enslaved women's narratives. The student recognized immediately what she was reading. Not just another slave narrative, but a confession to murder. A first-hand account of resistance that had been deliberate, violent, and carefully planned. The journal was authenticated, cross-referenced with county records, and eventually published in an academic collection in 1985. It created a small controversy among historians who debated whether Ruth's actions constituted justified resistance or criminal violence, whether the burning of Marcus Hartwell was an act of war or murder. The answer, of course, was both. Ruth had killed a man who owned her, abused her, and would have continued doing both until she died or went mad. She had done so knowing the cost, accepting that her freedom would be purchased with his death and her permanent exile from everyone she had known. The law called it murder. History called it resistance. Ruth called it survival. The site where Hartwell Estate once stood is now a soybean field 8 miles southwest of Beaufort, South Carolina. Nothing remains of the buildings except depressions in the earth where foundations once sat, and a scatter of bricks hidden in the undergrowth. The county maintains no historical marker. No tours stop here. The property has changed hands 17 times since 1851, and current owners have no knowledge of what happened on their land nearly 2 centuries ago. But stories persist in the Black community of Beaufort County, passed down through generations in fragments and whispers. They speak of a girl who burned the big house and disappeared into the river. Some versions say she drowned. Some say she flew away. Some say she turned into smoke and drifted north with the wind. Local teenagers sometimes drive out to the old Hartwell property on September nights, daring each other to walk through the fields where they claim you can still smell burning when the wind shifts right. They report seeing lights that might be fireflies or might be something else, a glow that moves between the trees like lanterns carried by people who are no longer there. These stories are folklore, not history, but they preserve a truth that the official records tried to erase. That Ruth existed, that she resisted, that she chose her own terms, even when the system was designed to give her no choice at all. In Beaufort's old cemetery, there is a section where enslaved people were buried in unmarked graves, their bodies returned to earth with no stone to remember them. Somewhere in that section lies Marcus Hartwell, reburied after the fire in a plot his cousin paid for before selling the estate. His gravestone listed his name, his dates, and a verse from Scripture about the righteous inheriting the earth. Time and weather have worn the inscription almost smooth, rendering him as anonymous in death as the people he owned in life. Subscribe if you want the next deep dive.